My name is Jake Sherman. I'm the director of IPI's Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's policy forum, Sharing the Burden, Lessons from the European Return to Multi-dimensional Peacekeeping, co-organized with the Permanent Mission of Ireland to the UN and the French Ministry of the Armed Forces. Today's event marks the launch of a new IPI policy paper of the same title by IPI Senior Advisor Arthur Boutellis and Major General, retired, Michael Beary, the former force commander and head of mission of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL. European engagement in UN peacekeeping has been a recurrent focus of IPI's research over the years, most recently as the topic of the 2018 annual Vienna seminar, as well as of past policy papers, several of which were authored by members of today's panel. European countries are long-standing participants in traditional peacekeeping missions, particularly across the Middle East, in UNSO and UNDOF and UNIFIL, as well as in Cyprus and in UNMOGIP on the border of India and Pakistan. Driven by a convergence of factors, including the NATO drawdown in Afghanistan and security concerns in the Sahara-Sahel region, European TCCs have significantly increased their participation in multidimensional peacekeeping in Africa since 2013. Although European troops contribute less than 10% of overall UN peacekeepers, the European presence in Africa is now nearly at its largest since the mid-1990s. As the report points out, these deployments have provided capabilities like air assets, special forces, peacekeeping intelligence, as well as training in areas like countering improvised explosive devices and first aid that are essential in operating in today's complex, high-risk environments. But as the paper also points out, mobilizing and sustaining such deployments have come with a number of challenges, with growing pains for both the UN and European TCCs, and indeed all TCCs themselves. Building on the paper, today's panel will discuss this recent renewed engagement by European troop contributing countries and provide recommendations on how all UN TCCs can collectively work together to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of UN peacekeeping. With that, we're going to begin remarks from the podium. I'm going to invite Major General Beary up to give his remarks. We're then going to turn to Arthur Boutellis, and then I'll invite the panel up to the table and introduce the rest of our speakers. So with that, General, the podium is yours.
Your Excellencies, permanent representations, guests, ladies and gentlemen, pleasure to be with you here today. And hopefully Arthur will stay with us so we can get the second part of our presentation. A special thanks to the Department of Peacekeeping for allowing publication of our report. Also, of course, to the IPI with Jake Sherman and also Albert Treehart, who helped us so much and gave us so much support. And then, of course, Ireland for financing our work, and also France for helping to finance this project. Arthur Boutellis and I started our journey, if you like, back on the 13th of January 2019 with the preparatory conference on peacekeeping in The Hague. So that was the kick-off. The ball was in at that point. And our aim was really to target all stakeholders regarding European Union and Canadian involvement and gain insights to determine whether sustained engagement was possible, what conditions are necessary, and of course our overall aim to identify a path toward improving UN peacekeeping operations overall. We were very much cognizant of the facts that 70% of all peacekeepers are deployed in Africa, and the European Union TCCs only represent, as Jake has mentioned, somewhere between 8 and 10% of those peacekeepers worldwide, and 50% of European Union peacekeepers are deployed in the Middle East. Quite a number with my old mission UNIFIL. You will know, of course, that the main European and Canadian missions at the moment include Mali, MINUSMA, South Sudan, UNMISS, and of course CAR, the Central African Republic with MINUSCA. So now let's look at the why. Let's get to the meat of this. Let's look at why Europe and Canada have re-engaged in the last number of years. First of all, Northern Africa and the Sahel region have been identified clearly by the European Union and NATO as strategically important for their national interests, including terrorism, criminality, trafficking and migrations. European peacekeeping contributions are still considered an important part of a successful Security Council candidacy bid. So if we look at that, Italy, Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Belgium, Romania, Canada, they have all provided deployed peacekeepers ahead of a Security Council vote. And of course, Council bids are therefore quite a firm indicator for the UN on which member states to approach when you're looking for peacekeepers. Following the drawdown in Afghanistan, NATO and the European Union still had the need to engage in multinational operations, practice interoperability, and provide a focus for domestic recruitment. So motivation to deploy to keep capabilities operational and of course funded when under national budget pressures. It should also be noted that European TCCs and members of NATO consulted for this report and on this study clearly rank their priority deployments as NATO first, EU second, and UN third. Other reasons why. Peer pressure. Peer pressure seems to have played an important part in the return by some countries, with some encouraging a sharing of the collective European burden to contribute to global peace and security. France has been the driving force, with President Macron triggering Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty for the first time. Also, the greater UN high-level engagement with ministries of defence in recent years has paid a dividend and has assisted deployment decisions, and the majority of European MODs with whom we interacted have been a positive force behind deploying in UN peacekeeping operations post-Afghanistan. Another factor was the 2015 Leaders Summit, where it was preceded very much by strong encouragement by the US Obama administration to focus European TCCs on the importance of contributing to UN peacekeeping. However, the current US administration, while providing significant logistical support, has not followed the same line and focusing more on meeting the NATO 2% defence spending budget target, as you know. Finally, on the whys, confidence in the civilian and military leadership of the mission has been cited as a factor in deciding to contribute. We had the example of Bert Koenders in MINUSMA, which obviously drew in quite a significant Dutch contribution, which was incredibly important to the mission. So now let's, for a moment, having discussed the why, let's take a look at the how and how they returned, okay? And while most European TCCs have preferred deploying for short periods, some, like the Netherlands and Sweden, have spent more than 5 years in Mali, and the UK served 3 years in South Sudan, while Portugal's deployment to CAR is open-ended. But many European TCCs have proven too small to go it alone and plug into larger contributions by major TCCs or on rotational arrangements such as the C-130 aircraft multinational rotation contribution that you will be familiar with. So looking again at how they returned. Firstly, deployments categorized as high-end, low-risk capabilities in MINUSMA, Mali, which is the main centre of attention. That would include attack helicopters and military utility helicopters, including Chinook and Griffin. Some configured as air medical evacuation teams, so important to the mission. Intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, special operating forces and reconnaissance units. Then there is the European INT unit, or a CIFU, the All-Source Information Fusion Unit, which you will be familiar with. And finally, on the high-end, low-risk, the C-130 aircraft multinational rotation contribution. Secondly, the return would include the high-impact QRF contribution to MINUSMA and CAR, often cited as a wonderful example of how the European Union can contribute to such missions. And finally, low-key engineer and medical units to South Sudan and also to Central African Republic. We would emphasise in our report that the return is not a monolithic bloc, and reasons for return are based on different national interests, military traditions, and historical backgrounds. Now I'd like to move to considering the challenges that came up in our report, challenges to EU peacekeeping deployments and the issues that were raised by the interlocutors within the European Union. First up, command and control. C2 was generally the first issue raised by military advisors from permanent missions in New York, and it reflects a persistent trust deficit among certain European TCCs in Canada. Rather than C2 generally, what seems to be the critical issue is who controls military utility helicopters. While there is no dispute regarding control of attack helicopters under the command of the force commander, difficulties are raised regarding these MUHs, utility helicopters, which could impact CASEVAC. All interviewees indicated the vital nature of medical support. This was up front and centre, and particularly adhering to what you will have heard of, the 10-1-2 policy as a prerequisite for deployment to UN missions. Any shortfall in medical capability that results in poorer patient outcomes can have an adverse impact on public support for the mission and, of course, as we know, has political consequences. Several interviewees from EU TCCs noted that medical care was the only real problem that they had with the UN. Intelligence, a taboo word for the UN for so long, has increasingly become a requirement for deployments. The aforementioned ASIFU, All Source Information Fusion Unit, experiment clearly contributed to a growing acceptance among member states of the necessity for professional intelligence in UN missions operating in high-risk environments, primarily, as we know, for the safety, security and force protection of peacekeepers, but also to enhance missions, situational awareness, and to inform operations and activities related to protection of civilian risks of the mandates. I'm sure you can see how important that is. Looking at some of the other challenges that came up, the requirement for a clear understanding of mission and tasks is central to UN peacekeeping, where the environment can be ambiguous and uncertain. Some TCCs noted it is imperative for the UN to communicate a clear vision in advance. Also, predictability of deployments is important for most EU TCCs to reduce political risk, and a certain latent resentment was detected with some TCCs when they are pressurised politically to remain with special capabilities beyond their well-flagged end date. Entering into agreements with the UN for deploying troops can be a lengthy process, with the most common criticisms being the bureaucracy involved, lack of transparency, and lack of flexibility on the part of the UN. But on a more positive note, European TCCs generally welcomed the new DOS, Office of Supply Chain Management, of the Uniformed Capabilities Support Division, or in short, the one-stop shop for TCCs, which hopefully will really realise its potential. Additionally, inability to utilise their assets fully. This was a common trend in the mission is a concern. European TCCs are often suspicious of UN air operations, favouring fixed-cost contracted aircraft over more expensive military aircraft. The ISR unit in MINUSMA, that's Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance, indicated that their full capabilities were not utilised. Skill fade relating to medical personnel, in particular in UNMISS, skill fade is a concern when the activity level in a mission is not at a high level, and it's further exacerbated when extended deployment durations of UN missions. European Union TCCs would prefer to focus on the desired effect of a capability, the effect of a capability, rather than the older construct of deployment in numbers. EU TCCs emphasise the need for advanced, inclusive planning, with a set time frame for deployments. TCC internal planning cycles demand early warning of new deployments, given commitments to NATO. Although the UN, as we know, due to the very political nature of peacekeeping mandates, is rarely in a position to provide a full picture of where deployments will be needed in the following 3 to 5 years. So there is this gap. A number of European TCCs have deemed positive the organisation of force generation conferences, piloted for MUNISMA, as we know, in May 2017. The UN planning process should allow more inputs from TCCs, which may want to contribute certain capabilities. And Arthur will be dealing with some of these issues in more detail during his piece. European TCCs support fully the creation of an environment to meaningfully engage uniformed females in peacekeeping at all levels, across the board. However, there are considerable challenges remaining to satisfy the quota set by the Uniform Gender Parity Strategy 2018-2028 and reaffirmed in A4P, Action for Peacekeeping, of having 15% of deployed troops female by 2028. Regarding financial issues, firstly, at the national level, reimbursement of financial outlays and troop costs are not of major political significance to many wealthy European member states and have a reduced importance in the political decision to deploy. Secondly, and in a similar manner, the individual remuneration is not a major incentive, and motivation to participate can be based on non-financial reasons for individual peacekeepers who are normally volunteers. European TCCs indicated that their population, their parliament, and their politicians had to be prepared to deploy and sustain its engagement in a peacekeeping operation. So therefore, the UN could do more in advance to communicate strategically the benefits of participation for a TCC, strategic communications. Okay, I'm just there. Arthur now on VTC. We'll continue with a look at the UN assessment of EU-Canadian engagement and on how to keep them better engaged over the next 5 years. And then Arthur will present our 9 main recommendations prior to, hopefully, with this large crowd, a very active Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back at IPI, even virtually, and I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person. So General Beary spoke of the why and who and how, European TCCs in Canada have re-engaged and gave you the overview of the lessons and challenges from their point of view. I'll now cover what we've heard from the UN and from other TCCs, non-Europeans, their appreciation of this return before going into the recommendations. So I should start by saying that the value added by European TCCs in Canada is not disputed. They deploy quickly, not only military capabilities, but also political, diplomatic, economic, and informational resources. But European TCCs are also high maintenance. The first issues that usually come up when discussing European TCCs with UN staff is the fact that they are risk averse and relatedly have operational limitations. Of course, the risk averseness is in large part the result of concerns over medical support that General Beary already mentioned, but not going or not flying to certain mission areas, for instance, where European TCCs may be most needed, also reduces their operational visibility. There have also been some issues in terms of European TCCs in Canada understanding and accepting of UN command and control, notably when it comes to military utility helicopters. Some, for instance, thought that it could only be tasked by the force commander, who could fly other non-UN missions, etc., which sometimes becomes a reliability issues. Several interviewees raised the 6 months rotation periods for European contingents and staff officers compared to 1 year for most other TCCs as a challenge to continuity and institutional knowledge as well. A bigger issue is when TCCs deploy only for 1 year, which in addition to increasing the costs may increase the risks of gaps. Another source of frustration for the UN has been that European and Canadian contingents sometimes want to be treated differently. In some missions, they refuse to paint their vehicles or aircraft white, and this feeds into an unhelpful narrative and perception of green versus white. The issue of gated communities or camps within camps is a similar concern. While every TCC has its own area or camp within a MINUSMA super camp, for instance, European TCCs gate their camps to satisfy their particular security concerns. This creates a division with the rest of the mission, but most importantly has security implications as European TCCs tend to bunker into their own camps in case of attack. Now, looking at the positive, European TCCs in Canada do deploy professional, well-trained and equipped contingents and staff officers. This is one of the reasons they are often held to higher standards than other TCCs. But UN leadership and other TCCs know that if European TCCs had different mindsets and political direction, they could do even more for the missions, as demonstrated by the Portuguese unit in Central African Republic, for instance. These TCCs also help lift the standards of other units around them. Technology is naturally another added value of European TCCs, which have deployed state-of-the-art ISR capabilities and air asset equipped with sophisticated sensors and weapon systems, but some technology are more useful than others, as we discussed in the report. Maybe less expected, European TCCs have also brought vehicles that are more adapted to some of the terrains than those of other TCCs, and enabling them to go off-road and further than heavier APCs. Last but not least, many interviewers emphasize that the contribution of European TCCs should not be seen only in terms of the military capabilities, but also in terms of the financial and political support that comes with it. European countries provide financial support to Missions Trust Fund, for instance, and the presence of European TCCs also helps keep the attention of Brussels and of the Security Council. It also, for sure, also keeps visitors coming to missions. Moving on to the experiences of other TCCs and their perceptions of European TCCs, we titled that section "Not So Bad After All," which I think says a lot. Feedback has indeed generally been positive. Some African TCCs lament that European TCCs are too risk adverse and do not operate in Sector North, for instance, in MINUSMA, but they generally do understand the imperative to satisfy the political concerns of their capitals and public opinions by avoiding casualties. Interactions between TCCs, European TCCs and others were clearly more meaningful in MINUSCA and UNMISS. Nonetheless, interviews with African and Asian TCCs in Gao, for instance, reveal that they do interact, exchange information, and collaborate with European contingents on an informal basis. The most often cited positive contributions of European TCCs by those TCCs is the air coverage provided by their helicopters, which reassure convoys and patrols whenever they see them flying overhead. They also welcomed information from UAVs in advance of convoys and patrol when provided. Many interviews from African TCCs had also benefited from training provided by European countries and the UN Mine Action Services before their deployment, and by mobile training teams, MTTs, once in the mission. Feedback on both pre-deployment trainings and MTTs was generally positive. However, some African and Asian TCCs also sensitive about receiving training in mission. Many European TCCs could also learn from the UK's cooperation with Vietnam, to which it eventually handed over its hospital in UNMISS, as well as from Portugal's work to improve interoperability with Senegalese helicopters and Bangladeshi, Nepalese, and Rwandan troops in MINUSCA. Playing together is certainly fun, but playing with others is even better. Now we ask ourselves the question how to keep European TCCs better engaged over the next few years. The first thing is that it will require the UN to continue engaging with European capitals more strategically and to be more upfront with European TCCs about the types of contributions and mindset required for them to have a meaningful impact in UN peacekeeping. It will also require continuing to build European TCCs' trust in the UN system, including by possibly adjusting some policies and procedures in HQ and the field. That said, some innovative models can make it easier for Europeans to engage. In the report, we look at rotational arrangements for capabilities that can't be generated otherwise. They prevent gaps and guarantee an exit for those TCCs, but also require a lead TCC, a role that few countries are willing to play. The one example we have now is the Norway-led C-130 rotational arrangement in MINUSMA. Joint deployments can also be attractive to smaller TCCs. This is not new and usually based on long-standing bilateral arrangements between countries, but they can be an opportunity to develop relationships with newer European contributors. We cite the example of Norway-Serbia cooperation over a level 2 hospital in Minur-Cat back in 2010, which helped Serbia being able to deploy its own level 2 hospital in MINUSCA these days. Triangular partnerships also are of interest, and they work best when accompanied by equipment and follow-up mentoring. For all three models, a central question is what role the UN should play in helping coordinating among TCCs and matchmaking. The light coordination mechanism is deemed promising by most of our interviewers, and the peacekeeping capability readiness system has enabled the UN to also suggest potential partnerships between TCCs. In conclusion, we make 9 recommendations for more, but also better European engagement. The first is that since medical guarantees remain the main concern for European TCCs, the UN should consider building future peacekeeping operations around first-class medical systems and at least one high-quality level 2 or 3 hospital. And the UN should, of course, also continue increasing missions' medical capabilities as a whole. The second recommendation is to focus on improving process for casualty evacuation. On the tasking authority of military utility helicopters for KZVACs notably, the UN should continue engaging with European and other TCCs to build trust and improve implementation of its C2 processes, the decision-making process being key, and potentially adapt the KZVAC and C2 policies which are being reviewed. Third recommendation is to strengthen the UN's capability to foster partnerships among TCCs, particularly for high-end capabilities in short supply, air assets notably, both between European TCCs and with other TCCs. Fourth, the UN should continue high-level engagement with political leaders and public opinions in European capitals and build more compelling narrative, strategic communication about how contribution to demonstrate commitment to multilateralism, make a difference on the ground, but also serve their European national interest. The UN should make European TCCs, fifth, the UN should make European TCCs and Canada, as well as other interested TCCs, feel part of the planning of the mission where possible, well in advance of deployment, and be more flexible for high capability units that may have a slightly different configuration. 6, much work remains to be done to educate European TCCs and Canada about UN peacekeeping and why and how it is different from NATO and EU operations. The UN can do this in part through assessment and advisory visit and pre-deployment visits to help build mutual understanding and trust. 7, the UN should avoid requesting high-end capabilities that are not needed or would not integrate necessarily well within a mission. European infantry companies, engineering units, or medical facilities, we find, can also make a significant contribution and help lift the standards of whole missions. 8, ensure European TCCs adhere to UN standards, paint their vehicles white, but most importantly, integrate better into security of camps and abide by UN rules of engagement. And 9, lastly, while we understand that European TCCs in Canada have a strong preference to contribute air assets for limited durations, they should also be encouraged to commit units for at least 3 years in a mission to give enough time to make meaningful contribution and to learn from the UN and reciprocally. In turn, the UN should give stronger assurances to TCCs that they will not be asked to extend beyond that time frame. Thank you.
We've heard, I think, quite a detailed overview from both General Beary and from Arthur on the subject matter of the report, including really the diagnosis or assessment, if you will, of European TCC's contribution over the last few years. We've touched on perceptions of other TCCs with whom they've deployed, challenges around sustainment, and a set of quite tangible recommendations for the future. So we're now going to turn to the response portion of today's discussion. And let me start by introducing our three remaining speakers. First, Colonel Richard Gray, who's the military advisor at the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the United Nations, who also brings quite an extensive background as a UN peacekeeper, as well as deployments with the EU and NATO. Next, Mr. Adam Smith, who's the team leader for the Strategic Force Generation and Capabilities Planning Cell in the Department of Peace Operations. And finally, Ms. Madalene O'Donnell, who's the team leader for partnerships in the Policy Evaluation and Training Division of UNDPO. So please, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jake. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, big thank you to the authors for their report, whose very valid conclusions and also very timely, and to IPI for giving us the chance to here today to discuss and elaborate on it. I will provide you some nuances on the Swedish contribution to MINUSMA, which is very well described in the report. We did indeed return to peacekeeping after some 8 years. The previous one was in Liberia in 2006. Back in 2014 we returned. And of course this interlude and absence from peacekeeping had some consequences where we lost expertise and know-how on how to plan and deploy and also how to operate within the UN peacekeeping context. This had to be reestablished, and I can only extend gratitude to the Secretariat. We had advisory visits, we had ample opportunities to interact here in New York, but also back home in Sweden with the experts, so to help us with this. On the other hand, being away and mainly focusing on NATO operations in Afghanistan did provide us with new skill sets, close air support, counter-IED, how to operate with the operational mentor and liaison teams with the local parties, which came in very handy when returning to UN peacekeeping in Mali, since this no longer being a very traditional UN peacekeeping mission. So the Swedish ISR, the Intelligence Surveillance Reconnaissance Unit, deployed to Timbuktu as the only European TCC in that sector. And even though it was tailored to provide limited capacity building to other TCCs in the mission, it came to the conclusion that it became underutilized. And this was in part due to the fact that the PK intelligence system was and still is under development. So there was no real capability to absorb the intel provided by the Swedish unit. And so in its primary role with the sensors and as an intel captor, it didn't really come to its full use. And another challenge was that even though intel units and headquarters were being set up to produce actionable intel, there was a lack of adequate maneuver units to then exploit this intel and actually conduct operations accordingly. However, it was not a complete waste, of course, because having deployed all these assets, these capabilities, has generated good momentum in the development of the UK PK intelligence component and capability. Subsequent assessments and the evaluations of the Swedish contribution show that the greatest operational effect and the contribution we made was actually in a more traditional peacekeeping role, using it as a conventional unit with its high mobility, firepower, and force protection. And so the conclusion here is that the MINUSMA really didn't require at that time, or for now, that sophisticated ISR capability. Instead of providing strategic intelligence, what was needed was more battalion level intelligence and maybe a brigade level recce capability to provide tactical intelligence, which is more actionable. And the tasks conducted by the Swedish unit, initially we did long-range reconnaissance patrolling. We used a lot of technical intelligence gathering, but it turned out it was the UMINT and the contact with the local populations. It was the short-range operations in and around the Timbuktu, the area, not the long range into the void of the desert that actually paid off dividend. So this realization has led to the joint decision by the UN Secretariat, DPO, and Sweden to reconfigure the unit. So yesterday we signed a new MOU for a light infantry patrol task unit, or a recce company, which will be conducting less of the ISR operations and rather more of conventional infantry tasks. And the paradox here is that a lowered ambition level for the Swedish contribution will likely increase the operational effect of the mission. So just a few observations on the recommendations provided in the report on getting better and more EU contributions. With regards to the medevac issue, we have seen development of a few new policies, the authority and command and control policy, as well as the medevac policy just coming out, which include things that have been asked by European TCCs and Canada. And we have also seen in the stress test that was conducted ahead of the, or as part of the medevac policy development, that not only were there shortfalls in the individual level of the body first aid system and on level 2 and level 3 hospitals, but in addition to the level 2 and 3, the level 1 is a crucial link in the chain. Having inadequate level 1 capability puts an unnecessary strain on the medevac system, the CASEVAC system, and which means that it's very hard for the UN to fill these requirements. So addressing that issue is definitely a recommendation there. It is working better in MINUSMA. I was serving there last year, and we saw that there are pragmatic arrangements being put in place between the civilian component, the support side, and the military component to address different scenarios in a pragmatic way and shorten the reaction times. However, the problem is that those are scenarios and there are indefinite number of scenarios, so we can't really cover for all eventualities there. So it needs to be continuously worked on. When it comes to partnerships, the light coordination mechanism is a very good tool. Capacity building of TCCs goes both ways, both for the TCC training. Another one also receives a lot in return. It's been noted in the report that we can benefit from having better situational awareness and known context. It is a continuous effort. Capacity building has to start before deployment, already when you start thinking about your unit, your contribution, and also when you in the pre-deployment phase and in the mission area through partnerships, which we have done with when we trained on Intel. Ensuring that the EU contributions adhere to UN standards, it's very important and should be done so to the extent possible. However, it goes both ways. I see that we need to also introduce standards in the UN system based on, for instance, NATO or EU, when it comes to fourth generation conferences, when it comes to development of CONOPS, concept operations, SOPs, peacekeeping intelligence, that the UN can benefit from other organizations, other standards. So longer deployments, 3 to 7 years. Yeah, well, that kind of conflicts with a lot of national interests and security agendas back home in Europe right now, and the overstretched situation we find ourselves in. So final observation is what we're seeing now is a lot of reconfigurations of UN missions. Most recently now the adaptation plan for MINUSMA, but we've seen it in Congo, Force Intervention Area, we see it in a lot of missions, and in a lot of missions it should happen, but it doesn't. They are very static in its compositions and tasks. So the question is whether these this changing dynamic in UN peacekeeping with quicker adaptations to security situations, to the newfound focus on transitions away from peacekeeping, if this would necessitate quicker and shorter deployments, we could actually fit better with European self-imposed limitations and restrictions. But it would necessitate much closer and earlier interaction in the planning process to identify these opportunities. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Richard. You mentioned a number of issues that I think directly relate to strategic force generation, and if I'm not mistaken, it was the cell that had a fairly major hand in commissioning the initial evaluation. So, Adam, welcome your thoughts.
Thanks, Jake. Happy to be back here at IPI, and thanks to the Irish for funding this study, and also thanks to General Beary and Arthur for the great work that they put in. I know they put a lot of effort into this, and we were really pleased with the results. Maybe I'll say just a couple words on why we did this, why we commissioned this study, why we think it's important, and then talk a little bit about the engagement we've been doing with Europeans, and then a bit of the what are we doing to solve some of these or address some of these issues. We think this is important not because, and we talked about this when the cell was created, kind of our general engagement strategy with member states. We thought it was important to engage the Europeans and get them to contribute more, especially in Africa, not because we thought that was going to fix our missions. That was the silver bullet. By no means did we think that. But there's a number of reasons we thought it was important that they contribute and be part of those solutions. One is that just obviously peacekeeping is multinational. It should not be just Africans doing the work or just Asians doing the work, but it should be a partnership among everyone. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. One, it's because as Europeans take part in missions in Africa, they learn about the challenges that are faced by other TCCs. And I think this helps us in the C-34, it helps us in the Fifth Committee. It helps us just with the peacekeeping partnership, because peacekeeping is a partnership. I think another thing we've seen is that Richard mentioned the kind of training partnerships that happen in missions. We've had a number of countries in MINUSMA, for instance, a number of TCCs, who, when offered training from a country that wasn't working in the mission, said, no, we don't require training from someone who hasn't been here, who doesn't know what we're facing. So having the Europeans taking part in the mission definitely helps that partnership, because those TCCs receiving the receiving end trust, and they give a lot of credit to those countries who are there. And then that partnership, you see it work on a daily basis in the mission. Richard touched on this, but one of the most interesting parts I thought of the paper was how the European TCCs are working with the other TCCs in the mission, and how we can strengthen that partnership, because it is so important operationally on a day-to-day basis when we talk about air coverage, when we talk about surveillance, when we talk about intel gathering, just operationally, it's really important. And I think everybody has a role to play in that. That's why I also like the title of the paper, Sharing the Burden. We went back and forth several times on what the title may be, and I think Sharing the Burden nailed it, because I think it encapsulates what we're trying to do. And then the other reason we engaged Europeans so much is because we realized that peacekeeping has changed, right? So we need the type of capabilities that, unfortunately, only a lot of the Europeans can provide. So ISR capabilities, some of the really advanced helicopters that have been provided by Canada, by Germany, by the Netherlands, by the Belgians, Romanians. So we need that, and so we need the Europeans there for these type of environments. I mentioned the kind of engagement that we've been doing with Europe. It's not just Europe. We have an engagement strategy for all member states, but Europe specifically, we've been pushing for at least the last 5 years since I've been at the UN. We mentioned the ministerial process, force generation, MINUSMA-specific force generation conferences that were really the brainchild of the Europeans coming to us and asking us to do this. We've got another one coming up. I should advertise it now so that everybody knows about it, but March 27th will be the next MINUSMA Force Generation Conference. Along with that, we'll be engaging EU member states specifically at the next EU Informal Defense Ministerial in Zagreb. So there will be a breakfast meeting that Mr. Lacroix will take part in. to try to encourage EU member states to really be part of the MINUSMA force adaptation plan and some of the requirements that we need there. I think there's some really good recommendations on the public diplomacy side, educating European populations and leadership about what UN peacekeeping is now, as opposed to what it was maybe in the 90s. I think there's still a lot of misconceptions about the UN, and some acknowledgement of the advances that we've made would be really useful, I think, both for the populations and the leadership. So I think we have a lot of work to do on that side jointly. Last, I'd just like to say a few things about what we've been doing to address some of these issues. And I think some of the work has been done, and I think in large part because the Europeans have engaged. So because they went to Mali and they saw some of the issues, and because they were in South Sudan and CAR, they could come back and help us work on the AC2 policy, on the Authority, Command, and Control policy. They could help us revise the Casevac policy, which I think both are much stronger now than they were before. I think the roles and responsibilities are much clearer. I think we've decentralized a lot and made it much more simplified, which I think will lead to better outcomes. So we need to promulgate those policies and make sure everybody's clear about what they are and what they mean, and why they've improved the situation for everyone and not just Europeans, for the mission as a whole. We talk a lot about medical and the need for high-class medical. We've been working a lot internally on evaluating the performance of our level 2 hospitals, our level 1 plus hospitals. We're just rolling out in the last couple months a system to evaluate not just kind of the COE or the force protection, but actually health outcomes. So if you go to the hospital, do you survive? Do you thrive? So I think that's going to go a long way in helping us improve care over time and address some of the concerns that our European colleagues and Canada has for us. And that goes for everything else. So we've been instituting performance evaluation systems for all units in the military and in the police. And I think you'll see the bar has been raising over the past 2 years and will continue to be. And the last point I just want to make is, and that Richard made as well, is on the LCM. I think the Light Coordination Mechanism, even though it's new, has a role to play in helping bridge that partnership even better between European TCCs along with Asian, Latin American, African TCCs. Also, we don't talk about it as much, but South-South cooperation among TCCs, because I think there's a lot of knowledge that can be shared there. So we're helping deconflict training, but also coordinate it in a much more efficient and effective way. So I think we have a lot more to do on that front as well. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Adam. Among your many points, I mean, one of the ones that I really appreciate is this idea that peacekeeping actually is a collective exercise. It requires burden sharing across the full membership of the UN. And I think at a moment when so many of us are focused on a crisis of multilateralism and division in the Council, the fact that we're actually seeing re-engagement by European TCCs in peacekeeping, which is, as many people are quick to point out, is the most visible face of the UN, is incredibly important in trying to push back on that. That is a good segue to you, Madalene. I think it would be interesting to hear about the role of DPO on the partnership file, and particularly outreach, as Adam was talking about, to European states to not just maintain the current level of re-engagement that we've seen, but to also continue to bring new partners in. So please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you not only to our hosts, but to all of you in the audience who've spent many, many, many long hours to make some of these contributions to these missions happen. It's not easy, but I think one of the benefits of leaving New York and coming back a few years later, as the case for me, is actually you do see some remarkable changes since last I was working with many of you. And congratulations, it's not easy. It's the result of a lot of work on the member state side, on the UN side. But there has been progress. I'm here to talk, as Jake said, about what more we need to do and what more sweat needs to be laid down in order to continue this work. And I think it's always better, as Adam did, to speak to how the UN is trying to speak to the recommendations in IPI before I turn to what we hope you, the member states, will do jointly with us. That's my task. I work mainly on our UN partnership file with the EU, but I think a lot of the 5 points that I'll make are also applicable more broadly to the set of member states set out in the IPI study. In our UN-EU partnership, facilitating EU member states' contributions and support is one of our agreed 3-year priorities. It's an explicit part of our dialogue. And I want to leave you with 5 points so that we can then move to the Q&A part of this. And the IPI paper, again, has made our job easy and set out an excellent set of recommendations. What are 5 things that we think would be really useful for the EU and other partners to do joint, and many of these are jointly with the UN? First, we think it's really important for EU member states to come together and establish an informal mechanism among themselves, the member states, to take forward the recommendations of the IPI paper. There are, for example, possibly at the level of defense, policy directors. These are a group among your member states that meets about 4 or 5 times a year. 1 or 2 of those having a sidebar meeting to take forward the recommendations of this paper, we think would be a really practical and vital way to keep this conversation alive. Why? Because the IPI paper has stressed that a lot of the member states want to do this engagement collectively between you. So let's set up a space for you then to have that conversation with each other. Second, you're often each other's exit strategies for some of these missions, and it requires really not only joint contributions, but if they're sequential, for you to have a good mechanism among yourselves to have those conversations and keep them going forward. Second, and Jake alluded to this right now, how to position this conversation within a broader conversation on multilateralism that is going on right now between the UN and the EU. Peacekeeping is one of the most concrete expressions of common action burden sharing in the multilateral system today. And contributing to UN peacekeeping operations is a chance for countries who are committed to multilateralism to lead by example. And positioning that within that discussion, we feel is very important. Third, the agenda on increasing the participation of women. IPI has identified some good practice. Increasing participation is really all about your national strategies to do so, tweaking those existing national strategies to make that contribution also to UN peacekeeping. IPI has given you some good constructive competition by providing some boxes there for you to take forward how well you're doing. Again, it's about numbers of women, but it's also making sure they're coming in a way that they can be successful on the ground and have a positive contribution. Fourth, greater joint public diplomacy. Adam mentioned this. IPI, it's all about us telling a better story. Part of that is within the mission, where your contributions are, how we can work with you, and also once back in your own countries, the IPI paper gives some good examples on how Ireland does that. Again, how can we learn from each other and take forward and work with you jointly on the public diplomacy? My 5th and final point is on the EU focus on scaling up support in the areas of peace and security. I'm talking now about several instruments such as PESCO, several financial instruments, including the European Defence Fund and the new European Peace Facility. How can we use these instruments to better, as we say, plug and play in UN missions on the ground so that they really, really contribute to real impacts? People feel we're finding a way to do that in the context of Mali right now. And I think there's also an important area of work there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Madalene. So we have enough time, I think, for one round of questions and comments before we turn to our 2 closing speakers. I would ask, if you wish to make a comment, that you please introduce yourself and signal with a hand, and someone will come around and bring a microphone. I have one just here, and then one in the back, and another in the back.
Colonel Vohrarik from the Permanent Mission of the Czech Republic. It will be a question more or less addressed to Mr. Smith. We hear of two different ways of generating forces for UN missions, one of being UNPCRS, the other one Force Generation Conferences. Could you please elaborate on how they are complementary or potentially how they conflict with each other? Thank you.
Thank you. And then in the back on the left.
Thank you, Richard Jordan from Blue Community Consortium, with a question for Madalene. What is the role, or is there a role, for the UN Department of Global Communications in helping you tell the story better? Thank you.
And then Piet in the middle.
He's on, yeah. Colonel Van Egmond from the Netherlands, military advisor. I think I'm addressing to the writers of the excellent report. So first of all, I want to thank Mr. Boutellis and Mr. Beary for their very interesting report. And of course the other briefers as well. My question is, I didn't read it in the report, but to be honest, I haven't studied the report yet. Have you thought about the mentoring role of European countries in missions, as a lot of EU countries put a lot of effort in training of TCCs, including Canada, by the way. So mentoring during missions, you can see as a part of the training of some of the bigger TCCs. Have you considered that? Thank you very much.
All right, great. Seeing no more questions, we'll come back to the panel in the order of speakers. So one on the difference between PCRS and the Fourth Generation Conferences, one on the role of the Global Communication Department across the street, and one on the role of mentoring. So General Beary, would you like to kick us off?
Okay, yeah. First of all, I'll take that last question from the Dutch military advisor on mentoring. An important aspect, we try to bring it out in the report as much as we can, and we know that we have the train, advise, mentor model. However, there is one piece of that missing, and the piece that's missing is something that was actually mentioned by the UK, which is a company. So that possibly is the last part of that puzzle, which we need to, if you like, encourage and perhaps implement. Because not only does it give you the ability to train, advise and mentor, but it gives you the accompany part, gives you the ability also to determine how successful your work has been. So I think it is mentioned in the report. It's something that we were very keen to highlight, and I think it's an important aspect of it. For us. I just touched generally into Richard Jordan's question there, that global communications is vitally important. We noticed in the field, and it's important that when you get to the field, you get away from the headquarters bubble, you start to see things much more pragmatically. And in fact, units who don't benefit domestically, their domestic audiences don't benefit from a lot of strategic comms, can actually start to, if you like, develop their own, and that for their own national audience. But it may not be in keeping with the mandate of the mission. In fact, in the Mali version, it can actually be something related to counter-terrorism, which is not what MINUSMA is there for. So that role, I think, is very important. I'm sure Madalene will develop it further. I think on the fourth generation and the PCRS, certainly the indications we were getting in our deliberations was that these were very positive outcomes. I think on the fourth generation, that's easier in the NATO European context. It's a little bit more difficult when you're dealing with the size of the UN and also the resources that the UN has available to conduct such meetings. So it's in a very preliminary stage, I would say, on that aspect. But certainly it had a strong following in the field when we were discussing it. And also the other aspects that Adam has mentioned there, the PCRS, raising the standards, helping less capable countries to raise to that standard, to be accepted into it. All of that is very important work, and it was reflected throughout our deliberations.
Thanks, Michael. Arthur, let me turn to you if you want to come in on any points.
Yeah, thank you, Jake. No, just to add a word or two on the mentoring part. We do speak to it a little bit in the report, but as General Beary was just saying, I mean, there are not many of the Europeans we interviewed that seemed ready to consider that because, of course, of the risks associated with it. At the beginning of MINUSMA, of course, the French forces, Serval, did a bit of that, of mentoring and operational accompaniment, providing support to various MINUSMA contingents that had been inherited from AFISMA. And it was quite helpful, but it was also, a huge undertaking. And right now, it seems unlikely that the European TCCs we've interviewed would consider that, and it would have to come from TCCs that are already in the mission if it were to happen. The other consideration for Mali specifically on this is that the French, as you probably know, have initiated a European initiative called Takuba, trying to generate special forces to do exactly that, but with G5 Sahel forces. So there as well, there would be some competition if the mentoring model were to be pursued. Yeah.
Thanks, Arthur. Richard, anything?
Thanks, Jake. Regarding the question on mentoring in mission, it ties into the necessity to have a continuous capacity building effort, pre-deployment, during deployment. And from Swedish perspective, we did train and we did sort of ad hoc mentor. It turned out that way when ongoing operations with other TCCs that had gaps in capabilities, they needed this. And I would think it worthwhile for the UN to formalize this in a bit better way, so it's not ad hoc and it's over the line. We also noticed this when contributing a mobile training team to MINUSMA, that there were other mobile training teams there, and there were things that could definitely have been better synchronized, and especially on training audience, who and what to train them on. So a global conference on that would probably be advisable. On the question on strategic communications to home countries, it is a strategic vulnerability for modern small democracies that haven't been to war for a long time. Any casualties have immediate political implications. So I would just welcome anything that can be done on that aspect. For fourth generation and PCRS, I think you're the man.
Adam.
Great. No, thanks for the question. I think it's a pretty simple way to look at it. PCRS is the central way that we generate forces now, and is the first thing that we go to. So all the new MINUSMA force adaptation requirements, the first thing we did was look in the PCRS and say, oh, let's look at all the attack helicopter units that are pledged in the PCRS. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of attack helicopter pledges in the PCRS. So that's why we have to go outside of it and do a fourth generation conference. So what we would do, we do the fourth generation conference. Any pledges that we get there, we immediately say, please register it in the PCRS. We'll go do an assessment and advisory visit. So it's still the PCRS. It's just we have to do a conference when there are things that we don't have in the PCRS, at least don't have for Mali.
Since our panelists were so succinct in providing their responses, if there are any other additional questions in the room, I'd be willing to take them. Oh, wait, I didn't turn to you, did I? Sorry about that.
Good thing I'm within elbow.
Absolutely.
Elbow scope of Jake. No, I mean, fortunately, my other two panelists have spoken to it in part, but thank you for the question. I did not plant that question. But once member states deploy into peacekeeping operation, often a lot of our communications is about the universality, and it is one mission. And there is a lot of communication work that is actually playing down the individual nationality of those contributors. and then there's a story once you're back in your home country, which is really just about that focus. So I think these are pieces that we can put them together more effectively. We can work within missions on generating some of the video feed and stories that are localized, that can be put together better with the story of upon return back to the country. And we continue within UN to always need to raise our game about telling the story of peacekeeping more effectively. And that's a broader challenge that we need to continue to take on board. Thank you.
Thanks, Madalene. Yael and Martin.
Hi, I'm Dr. Danieli. Two psychological points. One is in your surviving hospital, the hospital for survival and thriving, are there also psychological, psychiatric support systems for the troops? And in fact, particularly when you talk about developing countries, it would help both to not mentor, to teach the importance of these issues, the trauma-related issues, to the population, and for the forces, of course, themselves. And then a psychological statement, yes, you're absolutely right. When you have the Europeans and everyone else together, there is a statement of, yes, peace is our issues. We are in this together, which I think in itself is already healing. My question, most of the countries you're talking about that are countries that were colonialized by Europeans and others before, I wonder how much that aspect, that psychohistorical aspect, gets into the sensitivities even of considering the word mentoring, the top-down history that needs to also be healed.
Thanks, Yael. And Martin from Canada.
Bonjour, for those who don't know me, Brigadier General Martin Girard, Military Advisor for Canada. First of all, I'd like to thank IPI, General Beary, Arthur, good to see you, and Ireland and France for this conference. As you notice, there's a lot of guest speakers that says European Union and Canada. Therefore, we're great to participate in the study, and especially the latest report that really covered everything. And it's, we learn a lot, very similar lessons learned, command and control. I think we all cover, Richard saw it on the ground. We talk about strategic communications. But there's one thing that I didn't see it, and I call that strategic education. For example, Canada has not deployed a contingent anywhere in UN missions for the last 20 years. And it's been part of my job to educate my headquarters about, you talk about UN standards, but just how the UN machine works. And it's been, I'll give you a perfect example. I was briefing the commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force saying, sir, just to let you know, the UN will send a team to inspect our aircrafts. And he looked at me, he's like, Martin, what do you mean? The UN will inspect my aircrafts? I said, yeah, that's part of the whole process. Therefore, we lived through that, and yes, Adam, it took me 2 years to deliver those helicopters to you, but part of it was trying to educate my own staff back in Ottawa, and that's been challenging, and I know a lot of MILADs go through that. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks very much, Martin, and thank you for sharing Canada's perspective as well, because indeed it is reflected in the content of the report. Maybe what we'll do is a speed round of responses from the panel. If there's any final words that you want to make, and we'll go in reverse order. Madalene, I was going to give you the first opportunity.
Oh, were you? I'm fine.
All right, Adam?
Thanks. I think the questions were great. The first question about the psychiatry, all that. Psychological effects. I'm not an expert in exactly what our medical capabilities are in every mission. I do know that a lot of the level 2 hospitals do have some kind of psychiatric component to it. Not enough. I think we've seen that. We did a workshop recently in Entebbe with the level 2 hospital commanders, and there were a few that said, listen, we have no psychiatric support whatsoever. And that was one that was operating in the very harshest environment, where some of the troops there actually don't get any leave for their 12-month period. Their TCC has decided not to give them any leave. So we need to look at that, because I think it has really, really harsh effects on the troops, on the morale, on their performance. And just our duty of care, right, to make sure that they're taken care of. And I think post-deployment care is something we don't look at. I don't know if we have the capacity or the responsibility to do so, but probably to educate the TCCs more about what that means, dealing with PTSD, dealing with trauma. There's probably a lot of work to be done on that.
And I would be remiss if I didn't note that this issue is actually something that we have an IPI report that'll be coming out over the course of this year, probably not for several months, but if you are interested in this issue, something to look out for. Richard.
I would also see it as an excellent opportunity for partnerships, for bilateral or in between the organizations and that country, to help countries who are lacking in that domain. And thankfully, I was reminded by Adam here that Swedish colonial history is quite limited, so I will slide that one.
Arthur, over to you.
The Frenchman.
French-American, thanks, Adam. So I have no choice. I have to take that one. No, maybe the point I can make on this actually relates to the risk taking and the possibility of some more advanced mentoring. One thing we heard from the interviews we conducted actually is that the countries that did have a past on the African continent, colonial past, tended to have more expeditionary forces and traditions that sometimes allowed them to take more risk, but also to work more closely, especially with African troops. That is something we heard. We remember from the discussion with the Portuguese, looking at the Portuguese unit, half of that unit at the time we looked at it in Central African Republic was actually from African descent. And that apparently also helped a lot in terms of the local perception of the units and also perception maybe by other TCCs. So I'll leave it to this because we didn't look specifically at the question you raised. And maybe as a closing and to sort of echo my friend Martin, well, we hope that for you and for all those who come after you and your colleagues that this report will also help you in your work in continuing to liaise and educate your colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. General Beary.
Yeah, just briefly to piggyback on Arthur there, and Martin, your point about strategic education is very important, and it comes up in our recommendations to educate Canadian and European TCCs about UN peacekeeping, and really that should be incorporated into the visits and the evaluations, so that education piece is in there as well. And it's very important for countries who are returning to peacekeeping now after some time. On the second point, from the idea of the psychology, I'm good on this. My wife, I deal with it a lot. On the psychological side of the level 2 hospitals, again, I'm not an expert, but I would say and emphasize that really the principal issue that was coming across to us, top of the list, was good medical facilities will enhance the ability for deployment decisions to be made by European and Canadian and Canada. It's as simple as that. So that would incorporate, development of MRI scanning, developing of really top-level facilities, which would include good physical and mental outcomes for everybody in there, PTSD, whatever it is that's been dealt with. So it was top of our list. It was so important.
Thanks, Michael. I'd like to now introduce our two closing speakers. First off, Mr. Brian Flynn, who's the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Ireland to the United Nations. He'll make his remarks from the podium, and he'll be followed by Colonel Richard Ecombe, the military advisor of the Permanent Mission of France to the UN. And my thanks to both of your missions and governments for supporting today's event and the report. Brian, please.
There we go. Thank you, Jake, and thank you to the IPI for hosting us here today and for engaging in this important project. A big thank you to General Beary and to Arthur also for all the work they put into producing this really important report. And thank you also to the other briefers. It's really important to have the UN voice here today. I think for all of us, really, that idea of stepping back and analysing and taking the time to analyse what drives decision-making processes, whether for good or bad, is something that's really important and maybe not something we do enough of here at the UN or across the road in the UN. So it's really important to see and also to have a forum like this, as the IPI always provides, where we can come together and discuss these issues in an open way. So that's very welcome, and the report is very welcome. And I think, as we see from the turnout and the engagement and the interest, it's something that everybody finds an important topic. We were delighted to be involved in funding the project and involved in the project. I suppose, firstly, as you all know, Ireland has been a consistent contributor to UN peacekeeping for over 60 years. We have an unbroken record. We're one of the largest, and over the last period of time, we've been consistently one of the largest European troop contribution countries proportionately. So how we can work with our European partners and support European partners in being involved is something that's really central to us and something we want to do. I suppose as well, at a time when there's a sense that the multilateral system is under threat to an extent, or under stress, under pressure, and even peacekeeping operations themselves, it's even more important that we're looking at ways in which we can make them sustainable and continue to have that involvement and engagement. Ireland, as you know, isn't a former colonial power, rather a former colony. But I think a country's history plays an important role in how you can act as a peacekeeper. And I think a part of Ireland's engagement and how Ireland is viewed as a peacekeeper relates to our history. People see us as a country that struggled for its independence, that has offered an independent voice in the world, that tries to act as a bridge builder. And there's a certain affinity and empathy there. And of course, also, when you look in Africa, we have very long historic links in many parts of Africa, sometimes going back to missionaries. And those type of contacts and that type of understanding and affinity can play an important role when you look at today if you have troops on the ground. So I think your history, no matter what it is, can play an important role in how you operate as a peacekeeper. And the United Nations is fundamentally about collectivism and acting collectively, and that's something we believe in Ireland very deeply. The report and the discussion here today recognizes that the burden of peacekeeping has for some time not been quite fairly and evenly distributed, and that's something we need to work more on. Peacekeeping is our shared responsibility, and we all have to be ready to step up and play our role. Countries like Ireland have done so, but we also need to look at how we can help other countries and encourage other countries to do so also. And the recommendations in this report point to ways in which we can do that. It looks at issues around fostering partnerships, raising awareness about peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping in our own countries, in European countries, and it's something that's been important to Ireland. Over the 60 years, we have suffered many casualties, including in our first deployment abroad. When we first went abroad to the Congo, we suffered significant, relatively, casualties. But we've maintained that level of public engagement and public support for UN peacekeeping. And for many Irish people, when they think of the UN, or indeed when they think of Irish foreign policy, they think of the blue helmet. And there's a great pride in the contribution our servicemen and women have made over the years. But it is something you do have to work at. You have to explain why you're abroad, why you're putting troops in harm's way, what's important about playing that role, and it's something you have to work at, and we do. There's an urgent need now that we look at the recommendations in these reports, in this report and other recommendations about how we can more evenly spread the burden of UN peacekeeping and encourage more involvement. The report has a range of recommendations relating to resources, communications and political will. And if we can make progress on enacting these, I think we will see advances in the numbers of European troops and countries involved. We've already in Ireland started to look at what way we can act on these in a practical way, and we've also worked with EU partners in putting forward a food for thought paper, which suggests ways forward for collaborative deployment amongst EU member states to allow for horizon planning, and that would take into account member states' different capabilities, capacities and resources. During the Security Council high-level debate on peacekeeping last March, the Secretary-General called for a quantum leap in collective engagement. We fully agree with that, and we now need to work to try and implement that and work together. In Ireland, we often say there's strength in unity, and collaboration is key to a lot of what we do at the UN, not least when it comes to peacekeeping. Look at 13 missions, more than 100,000 peacekeepers from over 120 countries. This can only work effectively if we're working together. The importance of the recommendations in this report can't be underestimated, and we need to look at how we can now practically move on to implement them. And Madalene, you spoke a little bit about this, but a thought that struck me as I listened to you, and we can talk about this, Jake, but perhaps we need to at some point in the future come back on this conversation and look at what's actually happened. We have lots of reports and lots of recommendations at the UN, but what's important is measuring progress and looking at what we've done. So maybe we can come back and look again. For our part in Ireland, we'll certainly continue to look at what we can do. As many of you will know, we hope to serve on the Security Council in 21-22. We're not alone in that ambition, I know, but what I think is important is that on the Council, where mandates are shaped, that you have voices coming on of troop contributing countries who've had that engagement over many years and that knowledge and experience to bring, and we'd hope to do that. But once again, just to thank our authors, in particular to thank the IPI and to thank all of you for being here today. Thank you.
Many thanks, Brian.
Okay, rien que pour vous, mon général. Good afternoon. It seems I'm the last one, so I'm going to make it short, I promise. I would like first to thank Jake and IPI for organizing this event dedicated to the study of European and Canadian contribution to peace operations. I also greet and thank Major General Michael Beary and Arthur Boutellis, wherever he can be. Salut Arthur. For this extremely interesting and documented study. As you know, France is not a main contributor to MINUSMA or even MINUSCA, even if French officers are present and sometimes in position of high responsibility. We are heavily and durably engaged in the Sahel in a mandate to fight terrorism. To succeed, France needs solid partners, and that is why, among other reasons, we support the effort made by the Secretariat and by the TCCs to improve the performance of peace operations, in the first place, MINUSMA. The contribution of the European TCCs in Canada directly contribute to this improvement in performance. They are essential for at least 3 reasons: complementarity, solidarity, and credibility. Complementarity because these European contributions bring a strong operational culture and capacities which benefit the whole mission. It is not a question of competition or making useless comparisons but rather of articulating and making the most of the complementarity of these contributions at the operational level. Solidarity, because when we see the evolution of the conditions of engagement of a mission like MINUSMA, we cannot continue to always let the same countries take risk by engaging in the most difficult mission. As a French officer, I also feel this European and Canadian contribution as a mark of solidarity with France, which is engaged in the same theater of operation. Finally, and this is perhaps the most important reason, credibility. Because facing the current challenges of peacekeeping, we are doomed to succeed. Succeeding means implementing the mandates, continuing to give the missions the necessary resources, and obtaining the necessary budget for peacekeeping. This is what it is at stake in this operational credibility that we all call for. In conclusion, quickly, reading the study of Major General Beary and Arthur Boutellis is very instructive because it is very balanced in its analysis and recommendations. Everyone must make an effort, Europeans and non-European contributors, and the UN as well. Not everything is perfect, but it must be admitted that this operational configuration is still recent, and with time and efforts of mutual understanding, it will improve and bring the expected benefit. I thank you.
Thanks to both of our closing speakers and to our panelists. If you could join me one last time in thanking everyone. And have a good rest of your afternoon.